So looking at more longitudinal data where we actually see differences in protein distribution, it starts to become much more inconclusive. Welcome to episode 40 of the Smart Strength Training podcast. For this week's episode, I'm rotating back to the conversation around nutrition and specifically talking about meal timing and answering the question that does timing your meals affect fat loss and or muscle gain? There are lots of sort of like old wives' tales, let's say, around meal timing. The kind of classic ones that you can't eat carbohydrates after 6 p.m. because that will make you gain fat, that you have to fast before you eat because that reduces your insulin and therefore or improves your insulin, and that's the only way that you can burn fat, that you have to stoke your metabolism by eating every 2 to 3 hours, so lots of small meals spaced out throughout the day. Skipping breakfast will slow down your metabolism, and of course the ones around eating after the workout, like you have to eat dietary protein straight after training to build muscle, or you should eat your carbohydrates directly after training because insulin sensitivity is better after training. So that's when you have to eat your carbs. Sort of leading to that question then, that is that true? Does meal timing significantly influence the goal of fat loss or muscle building? So let's tackle fat loss first. So appreciating that the primary driver of fat loss is going to be total energy consumption. So therefore, if we're going to be thinking about how meal timing could affect energy balance, what could that mean? How could that work? A really nice place to look for evidence in this is looking at the time restricted feeding research, because that's a really great place where they will have directly tested this. So just to clarify that time restricted feeding is different to fasting. Time restricted feeding would effectively be eating every day, but they're modifying the time in which you're eating. So the classic one is the 16-8, fasting for 16 hours, feeding window of 8 hours. You also can fast for 20 hours and have a 4-hour feeding window. Of course, within this research, we can then look to see what happens if you skew your 8-hour fasting window early and what happens if you skew your 8-hour fasting window later. Because in the 16-8 research, that's being researched a decent amount. And we see differences, modest, not huge differences, when caloric intake is skewed into the morning. So when people start feeding early, first thing, and then cut their feeding window somewhere in the afternoon, people seem to experience better weight loss, fat loss than those that start eating later and then continue to eat later into the evening. So there definitely is something in time restriction or that time feeding when it comes to fat loss. But like I said, this when we've seen the results of this, it's modest, it's not significant. I think, of course, practically, it's really important to state that for a lot of people, when they get home after dinner, potentially is a time that we obviously have less distractions. Of work's finished, the children maybe have gone to bed. So potentially that could lead to more evening snacking. So by simply having a feeding time slot where you say to yourself, I'm not going to eat after 6 p.m., for example, or I'm not going to eat after 4 p.m., then you by default cut that out. So it would be more likely to state that by shifting your caloric intake to the early parts of the day, for a lot of people, that's by default going to cut out the periods of the time where they snack and eat more hyper-palatable, high-calorie foods, rather than it actually being something magical around the feeding window itself. I think it's also worth stating as well, for those that do skew their overall energy intake towards the latter part of the day, you're also then going to have, or be going to bed potentially having eaten in the last sort of hour, 2 hours or so. So the general guidelines are stated to try and consume food 3 hours prior to going to bed. So you've digested the majority of that meal. So you're not going to have any postprandial, so post-meal spikes in insulin or drops in glycogen, so that, or in blood glucose, which might make you wake after that feeding. So the add-on to that is simply that it can improve sleep quality, because we know that in sleep-deprived states, that dietary adherence and people's choices in their diet starts to become impaired. So there's two benefits to skewing your energy intake to the earlier part of the day. But this is probably more practical, having this knock-on effect of the fact that snacking will then be limited and it could improve someone's sleep overall. So then on the next day, they're making better dietary choices. So 100% fully on board with this idea of potentially skewing your feeding to the early part of the day. Of course, for a lot of people, that's not going to be practical. So just an awareness that trying to make sure that we're mindful around snacking in the evening and potentially not having too many high palatable, high energy foods after the evening meal. And of course, to make sure that we're really aware of when we're going to sleep in relation to when we had the meal, to make sure that sleep isn't impaired too. But any talk around it specifically being eating carbohydrates that makes people gain weight is definitely incorrect. It really will be more the practical sort of knock-on effects than it actually being something mechanistic, something like really internal that's driving that weight gain. So what about muscle building? Because there is a lot of misinformation still around should we or should we not be timing our nutrients to after the workout or throughout the day to aid muscle building. So it's important to state that for the stimulus of, or for the adaptation for the body to build muscle, what we need is a stimulus on the muscle. We need something that's going through the muscular system through a workout that is greater than before. So more load, more reps across a week, a month, a year. So the body is getting a stressor greater than the last to have to adapt to. Paired with that, enough dietary protein and sufficient energy overall, and then muscle building is a slow process. So then we can start thinking about the importance of dietary protein. And should we then be thinking about protein directly after training? Should we thinking about sort of protein distribution as a whole? So there's two ways to look at this. We have muscle protein synthesis research that looks at the signaling of muscle protein synthesis directly after feeding. And we can see from that muscle protein synthesis, to try and keep it elevated throughout the day, we want to try and have between 2 to 4 fairly evenly sized protein feedings throughout the day. So what's more important, it seems from the muscle protein synthesis research, isn't directly timing it after a workout. It's more getting enough dietary protein overall and then spacing it out between 2 to 4 meals rather than worrying about the exact sort of like workout timing to that. And I think in that sense, if you are having 3 or 4 meals evenly spaced out, you're generally going to have something directly after a workout, or certainly within a sort of like 2 to 4 hours after workout will capture that sort of post-workout feeding. We have some issues though. Muscle protein synthesis research is interesting, but by the way that muscle protein synthesis research is conducted, it's always very short term. So we're talking 24 to 48 hours. So when we're looking at muscle protein synthesis research and looking to see how meal timing and protein bolus feedings affects MPS signaling, we then need to also think about, well, does that actually equate to more muscle mass being built in the long term, recognizing it could take months to actually build muscle. You're not building any kind of muscle in a 24 to 48 hour feeding window. Sorry, the 24 to 48 hour window, which is what the limitation to muscle protein synthesis research is always going to be. So looking at more longitudinal data where we actually see differences in protein distribution, it starts to become much more inconclusive. And that probably makes sense because muscle building is slow. So what happens on a day-to-day basis probably isn't going to make a huge difference. So as long as the protein intake is sufficient and making sure the training is hard enough and progressive enough, they're covering your main 2 bases. Yes, if you want to go that extra step based on the muscle protein synthesis research and try and spread your protein out throughout the day, that's going to cover a bit more of your bases overall. But certainly the research into protein timing for muscle building when it comes to actual muscle building outcomes in long-term research is very inconclusive. Some seems to show that it does, but actually the majority says either null or potentially sort of negative. Certainly if it means that people are missing the bigger rocks in actually getting enough dietary protein in overall. So we want to make sure we focus on those sort of larger elements. So the kind of key takeaways are, I think practically for people trying to lose body fat, it does make sense to try and get feeding away from the sleep window 2 to 3 hours prior. And it also makes sense to reduce snacking in the evening. So potentially then cutting when you finish your meal to the early part of the day could really help just practically with that. When it comes to muscle building, which is also in the conversation around fat loss, of course, I think just making sure you eat protein at all of your meals is more important than like timing it specifically to after a workout. And to sort of finish off, because I mentioned some of the claims at the start, your muscles are more sensitive to carbohydrates directly after training, which means you are going to draw more glycogen, more sugar into the muscle after training. Just this kind of cool thing to know. That sort of means that dietary carbohydrates are going to be used mainly for muscle glycogen replenishment. That's not going to meaningfully change anything in the long term though. So these things can be factually correct. Like we have plausible mechanistic ties, but then what we see happen on social media is people take a plausible mechanism and make out like it's something groundbreaking. I think it's interesting. It's nice to know that you can have dietary carbohydrates throughout the day, and if you're physically active, that a lot of those carbohydrates are going to be pulled into muscle as part of the recovery process. But if you overconsume energy overall, that's going to be more important, or that's the bigger driver. So if someone starts adding in carbohydrates because they've heard that the muscles are more sensitive, and that takes them into, well, pulls them out of a deficit or pulls them up into surplus, that's going to negatively affect the outcome thereafter. So these things are interesting. I think it's great to know this kind of stuff. There's lots of additional benefits to weight training as a whole, but I don't think we need to start to manipulate our nutrition around it, because let's face it, like getting balanced nutrition as a whole is quite time consuming, and we don't want to add more stress onto people, because this kind of stuff is where social media gets people really kind of like majoring in the minors, and we want to focus on those big rock things. So hopefully this was useful and practical. You can put some of that into place in your own training and nutrition. And of course, I am available for online training, so get in touch with me by checking out my website, andyvincentpt.com.